How much are you paying a farrier per year to manage one horse's feet? And how does that number compare to what a working cattle rancher in 1935 spent on the same horse for the same 12 months? The American Farriers Journal's 2021 Business Practices Survey puts the national average at $131 for a standard 4-shoe reset. 7 visits per year at that rate lands you at $917. Add the full-service visits, where the farrier pulls old shoes, trims overgrowth, and addresses flare before resetting. And most single-horse owners in this country are somewhere between $900 and $1,100 per horse per year. My grandfather ran horses on a working ranch in East Texas for 40 years. His annual hoof management cost across that entire period never cleared $20. Not because he was cutting corners, because he knew something that left this country in 1942 and never came back. That $1,000 gap is not a difference in care. It is a difference in assumption, specifically the assumption that hoof management is a skilled trade that requires a professional to visit your property 6 or 7 times a year and charge accordingly. That assumption was manufactured, and I want to show you exactly when it was manufactured and why. The core of what I'm covering in this video is barefoot management on working horses, the specific packing formula my grandfather used that costs about $2 to replicate today, and the science that has caught up in the last decade to explain why what he was doing worked better than what most horses get now. Near the end, I'm going through the transition protocol step by step, because the part that most barefoot management guides skip is the first 8 weeks, and that's where most people give up and call the farrier back. The knowledge disappeared at a specific moment in American history, and tracing that moment explains why a practice that was standard on working ranches for 200 years now sounds radical. The United States Army maintained the office of the Chief of Cavalry through the 1930s. Every cavalry post in this country ran a regimental horseshoer program, men trained specifically in hoof management, trimming, packing, and conditioning. These weren't just shoers. They were the largest informal pipeline for practical hoof care knowledge in America. The Army's approach to barefoot management and sole packing was documented, standardized, and passed from instructor to trainee across dozens of posts. When the Army eliminated the Chief of Cavalry in March of 1942, that pipeline closed. The institutional knowledge that had moved through it had nowhere left to go. The timing of agricultural mechanization finished the job. There were approximately 26 million horses on American farms and ranches in 1915. By the early 1960s, that number had fallen below 3 million. The men who had spent their lives managing horse feed on working properties retired or died. The ranches they worked on replaced horses with tractors. The practical knowledge of daily hoof care, which had lived in the hands of working cowboys and cavalry horseshoers, stopped being passed down because there was nowhere left to pass it to. What grew in the gap was a professional farriery industry that formalized around the assumption that hoof management required specialized tools, specialized training, and a service call. The American Farriers Association was founded in 1971 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A trade magazine followed in 1975. By the late 1980s, the idea that a horse owner could or should manage their own horse's feet was as foreign as the idea that they should do their own veterinary surgery. The global farrier products market, shoes, nails, pads, and tools sold to professionals, stands at roughly $193 million today. That number exists not because the old method failed. It exists because the people who replaced it built something they could charge for. Recent peer-reviewed science has caught up to what working ranchers understood empirically, and the findings are uncomfortable for the modern farriery industry. Researchers at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences presented findings in 2023 showing that barefoot hooves displayed up to 50% greater range of motion than the same hooves under conventional steel shoes. 50%. That's not a marginal difference. That's the difference between a joint that moves freely through its full range and one that's been mechanically restricted. A 2019 study published in the journal Animals, authored by Molman, Dyson, and colleagues, tracked 11 horses through a complete shoeing cycle and a barefoot period measuring proximal hoof circumference, the circumference at the widest point of the hoof, roughly 3 to 4 inches above the ground surface, about the height of a standard hockey puck. Under conventional shoeing, proximal hoof circumference decreased significantly, with a p-value of 0.0002 on the right front foot, When the same horses were managed barefoot, circumference increased. The researchers concluded that conventional shoeing causes measurable hoof shape change over time. What this means in plain terms: a shod hoof is contracting under the shoe with every step it takes. The nailed shoe prevents the lateral expansion of the hoof capsule that is supposed to occur as the horse bears weight. That expansion and contraction is how the hoof functions as a hydraulic pump for blood circulation in the lower leg. Restrict the expansion and you restrict the circulation. Restrict the circulation long enough and the hoof becomes dependent on the shoe for structural integrity rather than developing its own. The horse that has been shod for years and then has its shoes pulled is not barefoot in any functional sense. It's a shod hoof that's been deprived of its shoes, and those are two different things. A horse that has been managed barefoot from the beginning, or transitioned correctly, develops wall density, sole callus, and frog development that a chronically shod hoof does not have. My grandfather understood this without the p-values. He described it the way ranchers described most things: the foot conditions to the ground it works on. A foot that's been protected from the ground hasn't conditioned to it. That's not an opinion. That's what the Swedish study showed in 2023. Before the protocol, the limitations. Barefoot management is not appropriate for every horse in every context. And I want to be direct about the situations where it doesn't work before covering the ones where it does. Horses that have been shod for many years and that have significant hoof deformation from chronic shoeing may require a gradual transition that takes 6 months to a year of careful management. Some horses with severe white line disease, chronic laminitis histories, or navicular changes may need corrective shoeing as part of a rehabilitation protocol. A veterinarian's assessment matters in these cases before the shoes come off. Performance horses competing on hard arena footing or horses doing extended road work on pavement are often better served by appropriate hoof protection than by strict barefoot management. A horse doing endurance rides on varied terrain may benefit from hoof boots for competition while maintaining a barefoot management protocol between events. The country matters enormously. Horses on dry, abrasive ground, hard pan, caliche, or natural gravel in the West develop wall density and sole callus naturally from ground contact. The same horse in a wet clay soil pasture in the upper South may develop soft wet horn that takes longer to condition and requires more careful transition management. A horse that lives in a muddy lot with standing water, moves onto dry ground for work and back into mud for rest, is cycling between overhydrated and dry horn repeatedly. That cycle is harder on barefoot hooves than either extreme alone. There is no management protocol that compensates for consistently wet housing. If your horse lives in mud, barefoot management requires addressing the housing situation before or alongside the hoof management protocol. The specific practice my grandfather used, and the one that most old-time ranchers across the Southwest used, was packing the sole and frog with a mixture of pine tar and tallow after each trim. This is the $2 secret in the title, and the math on the $2 is worth explaining so it doesn't sound like I'm rounding aggressively. Stockholm pine tar, the highest quality form available and the one with the highest phenolic compound concentration, runs about $18 to $22 for a 32-ounce tin, roughly the volume of a quart of paint. A 32-ounce tin is enough for approximately 16 sole-packing applications on a single horse, at the rate of about 2 ounces per hoof per application. That works out to roughly $1.25 to $1.38 per application. Tallow, rendered beef fat, costs nothing if you're rendering your own from beef trim or suet, and about $3 per pound if you buy it from a butcher. A pound of tallow is enough for dozens of applications. The per application cost of the pine tar and tallow packing combined rounds to about $2. That is the full cost of protecting and conditioning a horse's sole and frog for one application cycle. Why pine tar? Pine tar is the resin distilled from the heartwood of pine trees, and it has been documented in veterinary literature since the 18th century for exactly this application. The phenolic compounds in pine tar, primarily cresols, guaiacol, and creosol, are antimicrobial against the organisms responsible for thrush and soft horn rot. Pine tar also forms a semi-adhesive barrier on the sole surface that slows moisture loss in dry conditions and moisture infiltration in wet conditions. Bickmore, one of the oldest continuously sold equine hoof products in America, has been selling a pine tar-based hoof formula since 1892. The formula has barely changed in 130 years, because there was nothing to improve. Why tallow? Tallow is rendered beef fat, composed primarily of oleic acid and palmitic acid, saturated and monounsaturated fats, with strong water-resistant properties. When mixed warm with pine tar, tallow softens the adhesive consistency of the pine tar to a workable thickness and adds a moisture-sealing lipid layer over the treated surface. In dry climates, the tallow prevents excessive moisture loss from the sole. In wet climates, the tallow combined with pine tar's inherent water resistance slows infiltration of ground moisture into the frog and collateral grooves. The mixture sets to a firm, waxy consistency that stays in place through several days of work before reapplication is needed. My grandfather mixed it warm in a tin bucket. He used roughly equal parts by volume, though in particularly dry East Texas summers, he ran closer to 2 parts tallow to 1 part pine tar to compensate for the desiccating effect of the heat on the sole surface. A basic toolkit costs about $120 for a set that will last 10 years, with basic maintenance. A hoof knife, the short curved blade used to clean and trim the sole and frog. A rasp, the double-sided file used to level the hoof wall and smooth the breakover point. A pair of nippers, the hinged cutting tool used to remove wall length before rasping. That's it. No power tools, no hydraulic stands. A hoof stand, an optional metal stand that holds the foot at working height, runs about $30 and saves your back considerably if you're doing more than one horse. A pull tool to remove existing shoes if you're transitioning a shod horse runs about $25. The trim itself follows a sequence that hasn't changed in 200 years because the hoof hasn't changed in 200 years. Clean the sole first. Use the hoof knife to remove any retained old sole, packed debris, and any separation at the white line, the junction between the hoof wall and the internal structures, roughly the width of a pencil line around the interior perimeter of the sole. Trim the frog, removing any ragged, hanging portions that trap bacteria in the collateral grooves. The frog, the triangular pad in the center of the sole, roughly the shape and size of the heel of your thumb, should be firm and rubbery, not soft or gray. Gray, soft frog material is the first indication of thrush and should be trimmed cleanly before packing. Use the nippers to remove wall length that has grown past the level of the sole callus. The hoof wall should be even with or very slightly longer than the bearing surface of the sole, never longer than about a 1/4 inch of overhang, roughly the thickness of 2 stacked quarters, beyond the sole edge. Use the rasp to level the bearing surface and bevel the outer wall slightly to reduce the chipping that happens at the breakover, the front edge of the toe, where the horse's weight rolls forward as it breaks over during movement. The bevel at the breakover is the detail most amateur trimmers skip, and the one that makes the most difference in chip resistance on hard, abrasive ground. Rasp the outer edge of the toe to a slight outward angle, about 20 to 30 degrees from vertical, creating a rounded breakover point rather than a sharp edge. Then pack the sole and frog with the pine tar and tallow mixture while it's still warm enough to flow into the grooves. If this kind of documented, practical horsemanship is useful to you, subscribe. Every week on this channel I cover methods that worked on working ranches before the industry decided you should pay someone else to do them. No sponsors, no product placements, just the method. The transition from shod to barefoot is where most people fail, and most people fail because they treat it as a single event rather than a conditioning period. Pulling the shoes is not the transition. It's the beginning of the transition. The first 2 weeks after shoe removal, the horse should stay on soft, familiar ground. Stall, paddock, soft pasture. No arena work on hard footing, no trail riding on gravel, no pavement. The hoof that has been shod is not ready for abrasive surfaces. The wall lacks the density that comes from direct ground contact. The sole lacks the callus that forms from weight bearing on varied terrain, and the frog is typically narrow, contracted, and underdeveloped from years of the shoe bearing the load that the frog is supposed to share. Some horses come through the first 2 weeks without obvious discomfort. Others move tentatively on anything firmer than pasture grass. The sensitivity is real, and it's temporary, but you need to know what you're watching for, so you don't confuse normal transition sensitivity with a pathological problem that requires intervention. Normal transition sensitivity. The horse moves more carefully on gravel or hard ground than on soft. It may pick its way rather than walking freely. It will not be lame on soft ground and will not be dramatically off on hard ground, just noticeably more careful than it was when shod. What requires a call to the veterinarian? A horse that is significantly lame, three-legged lame, on soft ground. A horse that shows digital pulse, heat, and pain response that suggests laminitis. A horse that was previously comfortable on soft ground and suddenly goes severely lame. None of those are normal transition responses. They indicate something that was probably already present under the shoe and is now visible. Weeks 3 through 6. Introduce harder surfaces gradually. Short sessions on gravel or packed dirt, starting with 10 to 15 minutes, roughly the time it takes to hand walk 2 laps around a standard quarter-mile track. And building duration every week. You're conditioning the sole to abrasive contact and building the callus that will eventually let the horse work freely on hard ground. Watch for a pale, chalky ring forming along the inner wall surface. This is new, dense wall growth forming from the coronary band downward. Watch for the sole surface becoming harder and slightly convex rather than flat or concave. These are signs the conditioning is happening. Weeks 7 and 8. Most horses on appropriate dry ground with consistent movement are covering varied terrain without obvious sensitivity. Full work can typically resume in week 8 to 12, depending on the horse, the ground, and the management consistency during the transition. I want to name one mistake I made on my first transition. I had a 10-year-old quarter horse gelding that had been shod his whole life, and I pulled his shoes in June because the weather was dry and I thought the timing was right. What I didn't account for is that this particular horse stood in a shaded area of the pasture on slightly damper ground than the rest of the herd preferred, and his sole was staying softer than the rest of the herd's because of the ground moisture in that spot. By week 4, I was seeing more sensitivity than I expected. I moved him to a drier paddock, and the sensitivity resolved within 10 days. Ground moisture was the variable I hadn't tracked carefully enough. Your horse will tell you what it needs, but you have to be watching. Running the cost comparison over 5 years on one horse is where the math starts to feel personal. A standard shoeing program at the national average of $131 per reset visit, 7 visits per year, runs $917 annually. Over 5 years, $4,585 on one horse. That's without emergency farrier calls for a thrown shoe, without corrective shoeing for a hoof problem, without the premium that farriers in remote rural areas or farriers with heavy books charge above the national average. Many horse owners in the Northeast and Pacific Northwest are paying $160 to $190 per visit, which puts the annual cost over $1,300 on a single horse. 5 years at $1,300 per year, $6,500. The Barefoot Management Protocol cost breakdown for 5 years on one horse. Initial tool set, hoof knife, rasp, and nippers, roughly $120 amortized across 5 years, comes to $24 amortized. Pine tar and tallow packing at about $2 per application. Applied after each trim and as needed between trims, 8 to 10 applications per year conservatively, $16 to $20 per year. 5 years of pine tar and tallow, $80 to $100. Total 5-year cost of barefoot management with the pine tar and tallow protocol, $200 to $220. The difference between one shod horse and one barefoot horse over 5 years is somewhere between $4,300 and $6,300, depending on your region and your farrier's rates. If you run 3 horses on a small property, that math is $12,000 to $18,000 over 5 years. That number didn't exist on working ranches before 1942 because the assumption behind it didn't exist. The assumption was created, and the money followed. Working ranchers across the Southwest understood something about hoof conditioning that the modern professional farriery literature still understates. The ground trains the hoof more effectively than any product or protocol. Horses raised on hard caliche and limestone gravel in West Texas and New Mexico develop wall density and sole callus that horses raised on soft clay soil in Missouri or on wet pasture in the Pacific Northwest simply don't have. This isn't a breed difference, it's a conditioning difference. The same horse bred in Texas and raised in Missouri will have softer feet than a horse of the same breeding raised in New Mexico. The ground is the training tool. What old ranchers on hard, dry ground were managing was already half-trained by the environment. The pine tar and tallow packing supplemented what the ground was doing naturally, by protecting against extreme moisture loss in summer and providing antimicrobial defense in the collateral grooves, where thrush pressure is highest in dry climate summer heat. Ranchers in wetter climates, the Tennessee Hill Country, East Texas, the Gulf Coast, added more pine tar to the packing mixture, and sometimes added a small amount of Venice turpentine, a thick resin from larch trees with documented soil-hardening properties, to compensate for the softening effect of ground moisture on horn. The adjustment was intuitive. They were watching the frog and the sole, and responding to what they saw. A gray, soft frog in July meant more pine tar. A chalky, drying wall in August meant more tallow. No formula handled every situation perfectly, and the ranchers who got the best results were the ones who checked feet regularly and adjusted, not the ones who followed a fixed schedule regardless of what the ground was doing to the hoof. My grandfather's specific transition protocol, the one he used when a horse came off a shoeing program, which he occasionally had to deal with when he bought horses that had been shod elsewhere, followed a specific sequence that I want to cover in full because it's the part most modern barefoot management resources are vague about. Week 1. Pull shoes. Clean feet thoroughly. Apply a heavy pine tar and tallow packing mixed roughly equal parts warmed together, and work the horse only on soft pasture or stall. No arena, no road work. Week 2. Begin short sessions on packed dirt. 15 minutes. Roughly the time it takes to walk the perimeter of a standard round pen 4 times, watching for the horse picking its way or showing reluctance on harder spots. If sensitivity is significant, extend the soft ground period by another week. If the horse is moving comfortably, hold the current program. Week 3 through 6. Add 1 hard surface session per week. Duration building from 15 minutes to 45 minutes across the 6-week period. Apply the packing after each session on hard ground, not just after each trim. The packing protects the sole between trims and should be reapplied anytime the horse has worked on significantly harder ground than it's currently conditioned to. Trim every 6 weeks during the transition, keeping the trim conservative, meaning remove only what's necessary to maintain balance and address flare. A short trim on a transitioning hoof is better than an aggressive trim. The sole callus you're trying to build needs time, and the sole you have right now is the foundation. Week 7 through 10. Most horses are working freely on their normal range of surfaces by this point. Continue the 6-week trim schedule and maintain the pine tar and tallow packing after trims and heavy work sessions. My grandfather applied the packing after every trim for the rest of the horse's working life, not just during transition. He considered it standard maintenance rather than a transition tool. His working horses, the ones doing daily cattle work on hard, dry East Texas ground, had feet his farrier, the one he eventually stopped calling, described as the best conditioned feet he saw in the county. He said that in a letter in 1971. I have the letter. My grandfather's response was that he hadn't called that farrier in 8 years at that point, so the compliment was somewhat theoretical. People who kept this knowledge alive after 1942 were the ones who never stopped needing it. The ranch families who kept running horses on working ground, who didn't have the option of writing a check and having someone else manage the feet, figured out what worked through repetition and observation and kept doing it. What disappeared wasn't a secret. It was a practice that required time, attention, and willingness to learn from the horse rather than from a service call. A rasp, a hoof knife, a bucket of pine tar and tallow, and 6 weeks of watching. That's the protocol. Every horse on a property managed this way for a full year tells you more about hoof care than 10 years of writing checks to someone else to do it.